My name is Jessica Schlosser and I manage Social Suite's business development. Social Suite's ESG Go platform supports companies in taking their first steps in ESG reporting with intuitive software, expert sustainability consulting services to guide them on their ESG journey, and templates to share their great progress with stakeholders. The platform is built around a core set of 21 ESG metrics defined by the World Economic Forum, which was specifically devised to be simple and easy to adopt. ESG reporting is simply collating all the great work companies are doing already into a succinct one-page template to grab the attention of stakeholders quickly and get the recognition they deserve. It is certainly not reinventing their business, while all of our members have experienced additional stakeholders and big funding opportunities after kickstarting their ESG disclosure. I'm joined by our head of ESG, Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom, and Dr. Tom Schröder, who is head of climate action for South Pole, a global consulting firm providing innovative solutions for mitigating climate risks. Today, we'll be discussing the outcomes of the COP26 and how this will impact your business. And just quickly, before we kick off, we have an amazing opportunity for a CEO to be interviewed with Sky News. This is essentially 10,000 worth of media content included in the Social Suite fee. We only have 2 spots, so please get in quick. Throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat box on the right, and we'll respond at the end. Now I'll hand over to Tim. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jess, for that introduction. And Tom, welcome. Thanks. Great to have you here today. I'll just quickly run through what the outline of this webinar is. We'll talk for about the next 20 minutes or so about COP26 and what that means to your business potentially. So we'll just first look at briefly, talk to Tom about what is COP actually, what does it mean, how did it come about. We'll set the scene a little bit, talk about the Paris Agreement, talk about NDCs, and we'll explain what that is. We'll look at what are the 4 key things to look at COP26 from that business perspective. So we'll talk about net zero, Article 6, voluntary carbon markets, and impact funds to sustainable finance. And then really leave you with a few key business takeaways from COP26 and go through that. So first off, Tom, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm head of climate action at South Pole. South Pole's a pretty large business, and we were talking earlier saying, still expanding at a massive rate as well. Can you tell us a bit more about, what South Pole does?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Tim, for having me on this webinar. I would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on and paying my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country here in Sydney. I've been with South Pole for over 7 years now. Set up the Australian operation also in 2016. Our company is actually in its 16th year of operation now. We are a profit for purpose company, a social enterprise that's a certified B Corporation. So climate protection is enshrined in our corporate constitution. It's not just about profit maximization. We focus on the role of the business sector to drive deep decarbonization and help stop or reverse the trend of man-made global warming. We cover the whole value chain of the carbon or the climate cycle, and we're over 700 staff now in almost 30 offices, and here in Australia we're about 30 people.
That's a pretty substantial organization. So, great to have you here with your insights into climate, climate journey, and what's happening at COP. But really, I think maybe it's good to start at that starting point there, the climate journey. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is?
Yeah. So, I would probably first say that we focus on 3 main business divisions within South Pole to really cover the whole cycle, and that is first of all climate projects. So the development of new carbon emissions reduction and biodiversity projects. Then we work on the climate solution side, on the climate journey that I will detail now, and then we also have a 3rd unit that's called climate investments, that's working with both the public and the private sector in a blended finance approach to channel more money from brown to green, as we like to say. But with regards to the climate journey, this is really our core proposition for the corporate sector. We focus on setting out really helping companies to understand what their environmental impacts are, what their emissions profile is, because you can really only own up to your own responsibility if you know what you're actually responsible for. So this is the whole topic around measuring your carbon footprint, understanding your exposure to climate-related risks, and subsequent to that, we work with companies to map out the most promising roadmap for them, set the right targets, implement steps that help them to decarbonize their business. As part of that, we look at, first of all, reducing your own footprint, because that's always the first step, really trying to make sure that within your own operations, you can be as emissions efficient, let's say, as possible. And we only look at compensating for remaining emissions then in a following step. This can be done through our large portfolio of climate action projects, for example. And last but not least, we also help our clients to talk the walk, basically, and talk about their accomplishments and engage with their stakeholders, investors and employees.
So I think for a lot of companies that we work with at Social Suite, they're really at that starting point of their ESG journey, doing the first disclosures, starting to think about what does climate mean for me. So they're very much on that, that starting point, measure your footprint, understand your risks there. And there's quite a few of, pretty, small companies there saying, well, really should we be, measuring and calculating our emissions? We're a small corporate office. We got 5 staff. It's hardly anything. Should we be doing that in the first place? What would you say to them?
Well, the answer is yes. The Paris Climate Agreement has a specific provision to call upon the private sector and business to do their part to help solve climate change, and that's starts with small businesses, and of course it goes all the way to large emitters. So everybody is supposed to play their part. That's kind of the mission-driven answer to this, but there's of course also a more practical answer to this, and this has to do with customer acquisition and retention. Customers nowadays have a greater awareness, really, of the environmental responsibility of companies and of themselves as well. So they take into consideration much more, really, what the sustainability profile of their service provider or the brands that they're buying is. So if you get embarked on this journey, you're also actually doing something good for your company, because it will help you win or retain new customers.
Excellent. Yeah, that's what we're trying to convey as well. That message that start today. Just start the work. Start on that climate journey. Start working out as this first step. What is your footprint, and start from there. But really, today we're talking about COP. What can you tell us about that? Where does it come from? What does it stand for? And why are we having this webinar effectively?
Yeah, that's a good question. So. COP, first of all, there's a lot of acronyms in this industry, like there is in many other industries. It stands for the Conference of the Parties, as you can see on this slide, and it's the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. So this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was actually set up at the 1994 Rio Earth Summit. So if you count, of course, it should be COP27 this year, but we had COVID last year. So COP26, which is in Glasgow, Scotland, got postponed to this year. Basically, what happens is that, almost all of the countries on the planet are members of the UNFCCC, and thus have a seat at the table at the COP. And the COP is the annual event, really, where the members get together to review their ambition on climate change and to set targets. They're called NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions, as established 5 years ago, 2015, 6 years ago, 2015, at the COP21 Paris Climate Agreement. The idea really is for countries to work together collaboratively. Maybe we should also quickly say that it's really only since COP21 that countries finally firmly for the first time all acknowledged the reality, the existence, and the threat that climate change poses to human civilization and to this planet. So that in of itself is already a really big step. You could say the same about Australia with its recent announcement of its net zero target 2050. So at least they say that it's a reality, it's happening, and the COP is the body that usually meets in November or December for countries to negotiate, and every single country has one vote at the table. So countries like Tuvalu have just as much say as the United States, for example, which of course is a very interesting and equitable prospect.
So you were talking about those targets that countries set in the NDCs. Can you tell us a bit about that? How does that work, and what does that mean? That it's a national level. How does that translate to businesses?
Yes, I mean, first of all, we need to acknowledge that the Paris Climate Agreement is non-binding. We're basically in a club of friends, let's say, where there's a little bit of peer pressure, or things are supposed to move forward through peer pressure. Okay, sorry, I should have put this on flight mode. I will do now. Okay, peer pressure. So the underlying principle really is that the Paris Climate Agreement established the goal to limit global warming to 2 degrees by the end of this century, ideally 1.5 degrees as requested by low-lying island nations. This has now become the quasi-adapted norm. We've moved from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. And that's what all of the parties at COP21 acknowledged. And what the NDCs now are, they're each individual country's contribution to meeting the 1.5 degree Paris target. So countries basically say, we had a recent announcement at this COP where India now says they would go to net zero by 2070. Australia has now said 2050. Other countries, the EU and so forth, are more ambitious, but that's really what it comes down to. Countries set their target or their own little contribution to the Paris target. Yeah.
So there's a lot of that at a high level happening at COP26. But if you pick up 4 things, and we've selected 4 that are really relevant to businesses. Why these 4 things? And we'll drill into each one, a little bit more in the next few slides. But why are these 4 things at a high level the key things for a business to look out for?
Well, ultimately, all these 4 levers contribute to reaching the Paris Climate Agreement one way or another, and they are either practical objectives or directions for business to do their part. Or represent instructions on how they can actually do their part. This includes the topic of net zero, which I think we'll discuss in a second. And then
that's good. Yeah, but that's a first cap of the rank. Yeah, net zero. That's something you hear pretty much all the time these days. So really, what is it, and how is that important to if you run your business? If Australia is going to be, net zero by 2050 and India by 2070. What does that mean? And what is a business? What role do you have in that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the first step of the climate journey that we discussed earlier. It starts with measuring your carbon footprint, and companies, SMEs, do this just as countries do or individuals do. And what net zero means is that you have reached a state where you reduced your own emissions as much as possible, and then the remaining emissions that you're still responsible for, you balance them out or you compensate them through the equivalent amount of emissions reductions that you pay for with someone else, or basically you're financing somebody else to reduce their emissions, and you can make that claim against your own footprint.
Yeah, great. So your business, you're looking at that, you got your footprint there, the corporate pathway to net zero. So what are those phases in there at large that, can you run us through this? How does that work?
Yes, you see this is a kind of a forward-looking trajectory with starting with today. So a point in time is on the left here, where what I mentioned earlier, you as a company measuring your footprint and purchasing offsets to balance out your emissions, that would be a state where you could claim to be carbon neutral or climate neutral. Climate neutral refers to other greenhouse gases outside of carbon. So basically in the world of carbon, everything gets converted to tons of CO2 equivalent, which is kind of like the US dollar still is the one kind of currency of trade. So everything gets converted to this. And what then happens going forward is you see here the in orange, the business as usual scenario. So you as a company, if you're successful, hopefully you continue to grow. And if you don't do anything about your emissions, then they will just keep growing. But if you already measure them, what gets measured improves. So you will basically identify low-hanging fruit and ways for you to decarbonize your own operations, which ultimately also will save you some money on, for example, energy spend. And it will also save you money because you need to buy less carbon offsets to claim to be carbon neutral at that point in time. So basically what the light blue curve represents is a reduction of your operational emissions in your own footprint. And you then have basically two types of offset categories, broadly speaking, that can get you to net zero and that can maintain your claim to net zero going forward. So basically, carbon avoidance projects are supposed to be used under the Science-Based Targets Initiative for you to get to net zero as quickly as possible. Now, what are carbon avoidance projects? Those are projects that introduce a behavioral change or a technological innovation that bring that lead to rapid emissions reductions. An example is switching from, let's say, diesel or fossil fuel powered electricity generation to renewable energy. And basically this helps you to get to a point of net zero, which you just defined. And in that state of net zero, though, you're supposed to no longer be using avoidance credits, but removal credits, or those are basically two types of permanently storing carbon. This can be done either via nature-based solutions, for example, through planting trees, or working with regenerative agriculture practices to store carbon in the soil, or also technical removals or direct air capture. And in a state of net zero, your remaining emissions are exactly the same amount as the removal credits that you're purchasing. Then if you move forward and over time you manage to decarbonize your business even more and maybe invest more in removal projects, you would reach a state of negative emissions or climate positivity. And that's ultimately what countries and companies need to aim for to avoid the worst impacts of global warming.
So all this starts again with knowing where you are today. What is your carbon footprint? And then you can kick this whole journey off. Yeah. So what are some of those, best practices around doing that?
Yeah, so I've already mentioned switching from fossil fuel power generation to renewable energy. It also has to do with flying less, for example, doing more video calls, decarbonizing your vehicle fleet as well, achieving efficiency gains in the logistics sector, and ultimately decarbonizing your value chain or your supply chain. So what we see, and we have a nice example here of a few of the world's leading companies that have all pledged to go to net zero. How this is done mainly, as I've already mentioned, it's under the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what companies like Microsoft or Mercedes-Benz or Nike are doing is they're engaging with their suppliers to make sure that their suppliers also decarbonize their business, because there's only so much you can do yourself. But for most of the businesses, the bulk of the emissions really lie in Scope 3. So there's 3 emissions profiles and scopes under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and anything that's in your value chain, that's Scope 3, and that's why you need to engage with providers.
So to a large degree, a lot of net zero, it starts, with yourself, with your business, but to a large degree, to really get there, it's about collaboration. It's really about working together to get down to net zero.
Yes, it's about collaboration and also education. It doesn't end at your, let's say, at the gate of the department store or at your factory gate. It's also engaging with your consumers, maybe taking products back and recycling them at the end of their lifetime. Other types of waste reduction measures would be included there as well, or delivery. Yeah.
No. So you already mentioned, the ambitions, the targets that are being announced, being reviewed at COP26. So, raising that climate ambition at large, like what are those steps in there, and how do you, move through that? So what is coming out of COP26?
So it's basically different factors and factions coalescing towards achieving the same goal. So we see the ratcheting up of jurisdictions to improve their NDCs. We see the private sector making more and more commitments. We also see more finance flowing into this space, looking for economic opportunity to help drive decarbonization in the economy, and also seek returns. And it's kind of a virtuous cycle, really. And ultimately, though, what it also helps create is the basis mainly for, or foundation for more compliance and more regulation, which we also see coming into play. I mean, to quote US ex-Vice President Al Gore with his climate reality course, saying that we still treat the atmosphere like an open sewer. That's very true. There's basically no price on putting carbon into the atmosphere for the majority of global emissions. Currently, 22% of all global emissions are under some sort of carbon pricing scheme, but that's bound to increase both on a per country level, sometimes at the subnational level, but also on a per sector level if we think about global aviation or global shipping, for example.
So a lot happening there. Next element, we're going to briefly look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. How does that fit into, at large, or we're looking at getting to net zero?
Yeah, so this is basically the underbelly of the Paris Climate Agreement, because it talks about the transfer of ITMOs, which are the internationally traded mitigation outcomes. So basically, how different countries can transfer emissions reductions from one country to another, and there is no global framework for that. I mentioned before, there's a global framework for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. It's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But in terms of how emissions reductions can be transferred from one country to another, there is no body for that yet. There is just bilateral agreements. Switzerland, for example, signed such agreements with Peru and I think with Thailand, but I'm very certain about Peru. So what that would mean is what currently is in place for these two countries would become global. So meaning, let's say a Swiss Re, a reinsurance company, would finance emissions reductions projects in Peru. They could now, under this bilateral agreement, not only transfer these carbon credits from Peru to Switzerland, but actually what would happen is that Switzerland's national greenhouse gas inventory would be reduced by the amount of incoming credits from Peru. And yeah, this is something that basically needs to be worked out to make carbon trading globally safe, transparent, and reliable, and move it from where it is now to becoming very liquid like other commodities.
Yeah. So what are companies at the moment, and we're talking about your carbon credits and climate strategies there, like what are they doing at the moment there in terms of what are their options?
So basically their main option is voluntary carbon offsetting, unless you are a large emitter in Australia and you fall under the safeguard mechanism, or you are large emitter in the EU, for example, you fall under the EU ETS, you don't have to offset. You can offset and become climate active certified here in Australia, for example, by the federal government. But by and large, what you do is voluntary. And so you can basically offset, which is what's shown here on the left. This is actually a slide here that represents a more recent development published by one of the leading international voluntary standards, the gold standard. And what they now have created is shown on the right, which is financing claims kind of in anticipation of what may be hopefully decided in Glasgow by the end of the week with Article 6, that companies going forward could still finance emissions reductions in other countries, would make the claim that they paid for this, but that the credits remain in what's called the host country. To stick with our example, would remain in Peru.
Yeah. Okay. So what we see again is that to be able to use carbon credits, to use offsets, again, can't emphasize that enough, because I see a lot of companies still really having to make that step to, actually looking at that footprint. It's part of, like, for some of our customers that might be in the webinar, it's part of the framework we're using, the World Economic Forum framework, stakeholder capitalism metrics. Very first one in Planet There is asking you, look at that greenhouse gas protocol, understand what your corporate carbon greenhouse gas emission inventory is. That is that first step to do anything else. If you don't know that, you don't really know what your next steps are. So Article 6 is looking at creating that international market there. There's a lot of, like you said, voluntary, carbon standards and markets out there. What is happening with that at the moment? What do we see happening there? And how does that relate to what potentially could come out of Article 6 at COP26?
Well, we see a huge spike in interest, really, in international voluntary carbon. This has to do with a confluence of factors. Of course, the acknowledgement of the reality of climate change of the Paris Agreement is already a good starting point. We see a broad level consumer engagement in the general public, exemplified by Greta Thunberg or the Fridays for Future. So basically, companies also making net zero pledges in the corporate sector. So basically, a variety of factors that lead to a substantial increase in carbon demand, also in anticipation of regulation or compliance that is coming. I mentioned the aviation sector, for example, and what you see on this slide are basically factors that show that both avoidance and removal credits are increasing rapidly in terms of demand. That's also led to a certain shortage of supply in the market and to increasing prices.
Great. So there's a lot happening in that space. And then finally, around impact funds, sustainable finance, what do we think that's going to come out of that in COP26? What will we see there?
Well, I mean, we know that at COP21, countries pledged to contribute $100 billion. Developed countries pledged to contribute $1 billion annually to the Green Climate Fund to help decarbonize the global economy and provide the means also for developing countries to decarbonize their economies more rapidly, and doing so in an equitable and smooth way. And what impact funds basically mean is that it's a way for the private and the public sector to come together to kind of, off the back of vehicles like the Green Climate Fund and others, provide the economic certainty for getting low carbon projects, not just carbon emissions reduction projects, but other projects that help decarbonize the economy and also preserve ecosystems to help get them off the ground.
So from a business perspective, what would the implications be here for if you're a business here in Australia operating in a developing country? Would there be any relevance to this?
Yes, potentially. That's something that can be looked at then on a case-by-case basis. there are different schemes. There is also, for example, the Indo-Pacific Partnership that DFAT announced quite recently, where the Australian government also provides, I think, $60 million for the first 2 years in development aid that shall be delivered via carbon projects. And that is, of course, also providing kind of a base level funding support for projects to get off the ground, but that are always meant to be done in cooperation with private funds. And it provides both companies and also investors an initial level of confidence to make sure these projects get off the ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So key takeaways, we're getting close to the end of the webinar. If anything, like I think for most companies, if you run your business, the key thing is there to really start thinking about that corporate pathway. And a lot of people need to discuss that and really take it to, to the board level, start a discussion there. Secondly, then, start doing that, calculate your greenhouse gas emissions, use a tool, get help. Tom can probably help you out there and get you in touch with the right people, either at South Pole or elsewhere to help you sort that out. And really then, once you know that very first step there, it's really looking at reduction and offset targets. So, and like you said there, it's really important, start with your own emissions, really look at what are your suppliers doing, discuss all these things with your whole supply chain, upstream, downstream, think about everyone. And I think the other key thing really is make sure that you report these things. So if you have your carbon footprint worked out, if you are on that climate journey there, make sure you tell people about this, what you're doing, where you are, visualize that process and provide those updates to them, because it's really important that stakeholders at large see, what is happening at that high level there. So Tom, really great to have you here. Thank you very much to get some of your insights and really some of those core points out of COP26. And really kind of bring that message home around that we're all together in this journey here. We need to collaborate, and every business has their bit to do, and every individual has their bit to do to get to the point where we're at net zero. So thanks for your time, and I'll hand it back over to Jess and see if there's any questions that have come in the chat in the meanwhile.
Yes, please, if you have any questions, feel free to jot them in the chat box. Otherwise, I do have a few. Some people say that carbon offsets are not a practical solution to any of our current problems. Slightly a controversial question. They may have some future use in hard to abate sectors, but for current energy and industry emissions, they're deemed less than useless. I've heard it be referred to as a carbon laundering scheme. Would you agree?
I mean, you could, of course, argue that I'm biased, but it's definitely true that we hear these questions or criticisms quite a lot. And the point here really is it's part of a journey, as we've discussed, and it starts with understanding your own emissions. What are you actually responsible for? So if you reach that level of understanding about your own business, that's already a very good first insight. And it helps you ultimately to reduce these emissions. And if you pay for carbon offsets, you're actually pricing pollution into your balance sheet. And I think that's really important. And ultimately, you are driving emissions reductions in a publicly scrutinized and transparent and robust manner by switching, let's say, poor communities in India to renewables, so paying for solar panels, for example, on roofs, reducing timber consumption in Africa by switching to efficient cook stoves, working with cattle producers to make sure that methane and CO2 emissions related to livestock production are reduced. There are countless examples, and of course, this is an industry that's now been around for roughly 20 years. That's also had its kind of growing pains. And unfortunately, like in other sectors, there's always bad actors and there's the serious ones. So if you're interested to work in this space, look for a reputable company to help get you started that's working with robust government mandated or internationally recognized standards. and then you can't really go wrong. But I think it's in a way, it's probably also a cop-out saying, this is all not really working, so I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was great. Thank you. I do have an excellent question from Steve. Where does the money finally go for buying carbon credits? Is there legislation to ensure these funds are being used to become more sustainable?
Yes, good question. It depends on where you're financing emissions. Let's stick close to home here. If you do this in Australia, you are financing emissions reductions in this country as part of the government's emissions reduction fund. So you are paying, you are basically paying landowners to change land management practices. You are paying industrial facilities to modernize. So yeah, the answer is that the bulk of the very large proportion of the money that you spend goes to the people that are actually implementing these improvements or behavior changes. A proportion, of course, also goes to companies like ourselves, who generally help landowners, project owners navigate this still rather complicated and scientific space. Portion of the money also goes to the registries and the standards, so whoever certifies and registers the project, and then also a fraction goes to the third-party auditors, for example. So there's a lot of checks and balances baked into this system as well, and that has a price, but I can assure you that the proportion is really very low.
Okay, great. No, Steve's actually based in New Zealand, so they are miles ahead of Australia in their carbon offset efforts.
Yeah, so they have the NZUs. They have a New Zealand scheme that is also very robust, that only focuses on the forestry sector, and that also supports New Zealand meet its Paris targets. Just like here in Australia, the ERF supports Australia to meet its Paris targets.
Okay, that was fantastic. Now, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to reach out. It'd be great to connect. Thank you so much for your time, Tim and Tom. That was very helpful. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.